I live in the United States of America. Like most of my fellow Americans, my morning beverage of choice is this: coffee. Sure, I drink tea every now and again, but I drink coffee far more often. So do most people here. When Americans think of tea, it's either as a high fructose corn syrup delivery device or for its role in that one event in our history. You know, the Boston Tea Party. This instance of direct protest by the colonists took place just over 250 years ago, and in the history of the United States, it's a big deal. In a city with as much history as Boston, it still draws a lot of attention. They have a museum dedicated to it. I went there. It was pretty cool. The Boston Tea Party was but one of many events that led to American independence, but previous spats between the colonists and agents of the crown had off-ramps available to de-escalate hostilities. After 3 shiploads of tea were dumped into Boston Harbor, war between the colonies and Great Britain became inevitable, and within 16 months, the first shots of that war were fired. The Tea Party and the events leading up to it forever associated tea with British rule in the collective consciousness of Americans, so much so that our choice of caffeinated beverage is tied to it. But is this a valid connection? Did the Boston Tea Party lead the United States to become a coffee-drinking nation? And would we all be drinking tea if the Boston Tea Party never happened? To answer these questions, first we need to look at the events that led Bostonians to toss that tea into the harbor without a care for its effects to the Fenway flounder.
Is that a fish?
It was.
The year is 1764. Great Britain had just fought a war against France, as they often did. This one was fought in part on the North American continent, and among the combatants were settlers from both the British colonies and New France, as well as Native American allies from both sides. This war was a British victory. It was also very expensive. Not only did Britain need to pay its debts from the war, it also needed to pay for troops to protect the colonies on the North American frontier. Originally, this was accomplished by taxing subjects in Great Britain itself, but that led to economic problems at home, so the British Parliament decided to tax the colonies instead. That year, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which implemented a 3 pence per gallon tax on molasses, an important commodity for the production of rum, one of the most consumed beverages in the colonies at the time. This act actually halved the tax on molasses, but the previous tax was seldomly collected, and the new act also included provisions for stricter tax enforcement. This came at a terrible time for the colonies, as they were going through a post-war economic depression, and profit margins on rum were already very small. The next year, the Stamp Act was passed, requiring that revenue stamps be purchased and placed on all paper goods and documents. This included, among other things, purchase orders, legal documents, and newspapers, which upset merchants, lawyers, and publishers, the last 3 groups of people that you want to make mad. The financial burden of these taxes during an economic downturn was very real, but an equally important issue was that these taxes were imposed by a legislature thousands of miles away, on another continent. If revenue needed to be raised to support their defense, the colonists felt that it should be imposed by their own legislatures and voted on by their own representatives. That whole no taxation without representation thing. Newspapers and pamphlets were printed denouncing the Stamp Act. British goods were boycotted. Protests were held. Some of them turned violent. The Sugar and Stamp Act would be repealed the next year, but that wouldn't be the end of the taxes. In 1767, the Townshend Acts were passed. Among them was the Revenue Act. This placed a duty on a number of goods, including glass, paint, paper, and tea. This also allowed for the issuing of warrants to search private property, allowing customs officials to more easily search for smuggled goods. The colonists took this as an affront to their private property rights, so more protests and more boycotts, particularly in Boston. Like the Sugar and Stamp Acts before, the duties would be repealed in 1770, but not before British troops were sent to Boston to restore order. And the repeal was only partial. The duty on tea remained, and colonists continued to boycott it, or get tea smuggled in by Dutch traders. Tensions remained high in Boston, with the British soldiers still in town. In March of 1770, 5 colonists were killed by British musket fire, and news of this event spread throughout the colonies. Then, in 1773, came the Tea Act. This renewed the Townshend duty on tea and gave the British East India Company a monopoly on importing tea to the North American colonies. The boycotts were having their desired effect, and the East India Company's warehouses in London were overflowing with unsold tea. This, combined with a famine in Bengal, had put the company in financial ruin, and this was a way for Parliament to bail the company out while continuing to assert its right to tax the colonies. This also eliminated the middlemen in Britain as well as the taxes they paid, making tea cheaper than before and making tea smuggling less financially viable. But by now, the colonists had dug in their heels. They weren't paying Parliament's tax, and they weren't buying the company's tea. The East India Company sent several ships to American ports to sell their tea. Ports like Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. By law, the company had to offload their cargo and pay their duties within 20 days of arrival, or else have their cargo seized by customs officials. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, the uproar over the Tea Act led all the company's American partners to resign their tea consignments before the ships arrived. With no one to receive the tea in port, the tea in Charleston was seized by customs, and the ships in Philadelphia and New York sailed back to England with their cargo. Boston wasn't so lucky. Massachusetts Bay's colonial governor, Thomas Hutchinson, fed up with the unruly Bostonians, was determined to see the tea make its way to market. He convinced Boston's consignees not to resign and refused to let any ships leave Boston Harbor without unloading their cargo. The Dartmouth was the first tea ship into Boston, arriving on November 28, 1773. Determined to prevent their duty from being paid, groups of Bostonians met the vessel, preventing it from tying up and offloading its cargo. The same would happen to the Eleanor on December 2nd and the Beaver, which wouldn't arrive until December 15th due to a 2-week quarantine for smallpox. A fourth ship, the William, ran aground off Cape Cod on December 10th and never made it to Boston. Bostonians would guard these ships to prevent offloading of cargo, and on December 16th, the deadline for the Dartmouth, over 5,000 people gathered at the Old South Meeting House in anticipation. A final appeal was sent to Governor Hutchinson to allow the ships to sail back to England with their tea, but he refused. Word of his refusal reached the crowd at the Old South Meeting House, and Samuel Adams, founder of the local organizing group the Sons of Liberty, was heard to say, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country." John Hancock, a successful local merchant, added, "Let every man do what is right in his own eyes." It is not known if these statements were meant as a signal to the crowd, but we do know what happened next. Around 7 p.m., somewhere between 30 and 130 members of the Sons of Liberty boarded the tea ships, disguised as Mohawk Indians. Over the course of the next 3 hours, they would dump all the tea into Boston Harbor. In total, 342 chests of tea were destroyed, resulting in over 9,000 pounds of damage, nearly $2 million adjusted for inflation. Unlike earlier protests, there was no violence perpetrated against people, with the only damage being done to property, primarily the tea. Similar tea parties would take place in other cities. Tea was dumped in New York when East India Company ships returned, and a tea ship was burned in Annapolis. In Boston, they held a second tea party in March of 1774. Governor Hutchinson and the Crown were not pleased, and Parliament was determined to punish Boston and the province of Massachusetts Bay. These tea parties led to the passing of the Intolerable Acts. 3 of these acts were aimed squarely at Massachusetts Bay. Boston Harbor was closed until the property damage and duties from the tea were paid. The colony was stripped of self-governance, with power put directly in the hands of the governor, and change of venue for trials in Massachusetts Bay to other colonies or to Great Britain was now allowed at the governor's discretion. Another act applied to all American colonies, allowing governors to quarter British soldiers in unoccupied buildings. In case you were wondering where the Third Amendment came from. And the last one, the Quebec Act, did a number of things, among them giving all territory north of the Ohio River to what would eventually become Canada. This brought the landholdings of several wealthy and influential Virginians into question, which got their attention. All American colonies were now questioning their relationship with Mother Britain. 12 of the 13 colonies would send representatives to Philadelphia in September of 1774 to coordinate their responses to the Intolerable Acts. Local militias were formed, and in April of the following year, an expedition by the British Army to locate and seize militia weapons in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord led to shots being fired. And the next summer, the colonies declared their independence from Britain. So, did America switch to coffee because of the Boston Tea Party? Well, that question is a bit misleading. The American colonies were already boycotting British tea in the years leading up to the Tea Party, as a result of the duties levied under the Tea Act and the Townshend Acts before that. The drop in popularity of tea and the Boston Tea Party were both symptoms of the same problem, the tea taxes. But you have to admit, name-dropping the Boston Tea Party does make for a better video title. So instead, let's ask, did the tea taxes lead the United States to stop drinking tea? The answer to this is a very definitive yes, sort of. The Revenue and Tea Acts and the ensuing boycotts did lead to negative connotations towards tea in America. By the late 18th century, tea had replaced coffee in popularity in England and was quickly ingraining itself into British culture. This connection would continue to grow over the following centuries, and tea remains a staple of British life today. It was a natural reaction for Americans to reject tea and embrace coffee as a result of the tax acts. This is supported by contemporary accounts, including this one from future U.S. President John Adams in 1774. When I first came to this house, it was late in the afternoon, and I had ridden 35 miles at least. Madam, I said to Mrs. Houston, is it lawful for a weary traveler to refresh himself with a dish of tea, provided it had been honestly smuggled or paid no duties? No, sir, she said. We have renounced all tea in this place. I can't make tea, but he can make you coffee. Accordingly, I have drank coffee every afternoon since, and have borne it very well. Tea must be universally renounced. I must be weaned, and the sooner the better. However, it should be noted that tea was not widely consumed by common people in the American colonies. At the time, tea was only cultivated in East Asia, primarily in China, and to a lesser extent Japan. As Japan was still closed to trade in the late 18th century, all tea came from China, and it was expensive. The British would ultimately cultivate tea in India, bringing the price down, but that wouldn't happen until the mid-19th century. I made a video about that. With the cost high, tea in the colonies was mostly available to the wealthy, sort of a status symbol. Most consumers of tea were women. Most men, even upper-class men, were drinking ale or rum. Tea was important, but not the kind of thing your average colonist would be drinking the way your average Brit drinks tea today or your average American drinks coffee today. So it's clear that those who were drinking tea stopped in the wake of the taxes, boycotts, and protests, and they would switch to coffee. But the number of people affected was much smaller than modern consumption would imply. Which raises the question, what if the tea taxes were never implemented, and the Boston Tea Party never took place? First, let me state that I'm not going to explore if these never happened because the American Revolution never happened, or that the war was won by Britain. A change that huge would have so many ramifications that a beverage YouTuber like myself would be ill-equipped to explore them all. Besides, that scenario has been covered by many other videos here on YouTube. Here's one from Alternative History Hub, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. Instead, let us explore what would happen if America still gained independence, but without the Tea Act or the Boston Tea Party. In this timeline, British Parliament still exerts its power of taxation over the colonies, but finds a different way to do so. Instead of tea, Britain puts duties on, let's say, molasses. Again. Colonists drank more rum than tea anyways, so they hit us where it hurts most. The Townshend Acts tax molasses instead of tea, and instead of the 1773 Tea Act, we get the Second Sugar Act. Would this improve the reputation of tea in the colonies? Yes. Would this lead the newly independent United States to become a tea-drinking nation? Probably not. In any scenario where America fights a war of independence with Great Britain and wins, it would be disruptive to trade between the two. There wouldn't be a tea boycott leading up to the war, but British goods would be harder to come by during the war. Sure, smuggled Dutch tea would be an option, but it wouldn't be enough to compensate for the loss of tea supply from Britain. Coffee, on the other hand, would be much easier to get supplies of during the war. Coffee seedlings were brought to the Caribbean island of Martinique by the French in the 1720s. By the late 18th century, coffee cultivation was already widespread in the Western Hemisphere, in colonies controlled by France, Spain, and Portugal. Tea, on the other hand, was only cultivated for export in China, and trade with China was dominated by Great Britain, the nation we were at war with. But the war would eventually end, and relations with Britain would be reestablished. Surely Americans would go back to drinking tea, right? Not necessarily. Geography and political developments would still push the United States towards drinking coffee. With coffee cultivation taking place so much closer, coffee would still be a more attractive option. As for our relations with Great Britain, they would still be shaky for the next several decades. The United States would fluctuate between having closer relations with Britain and France in the early years of independence, and we would be at war with Britain again in 1812. The supply of coffee would be far more reliable than the supply of tea for our young nation, so we would still likely gravitate towards coffee. To illustrate this, let's look at another nation born out of the British colonial project in North America, Canada. They remained part of the British Empire after the United States won independence and are still in the Commonwealth of Nations today. Their relationship with Britain remained stronger than ours throughout history, and they still have the same monarch as the United Kingdom. It was also the landing spot for many loyalists after the war. However, they share a massive land border with the United States, we're their largest trading partner, and they have stronger cultural ties with us than they do with Britain. They also have closer access to coffee from Central and South America than they do tea from Asia and Africa. As such, Canada drinks more coffee than they do tea. This applies to other former British colonies. The ones that have stronger economic, geographic, and cultural ties to the United Kingdom drink tea. The ones that have stronger ties to the United States drink coffee. And the ones whose ties are evenly split are Australia and drink coffee and tea more or less evenly. The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party were pivotal events in American history and in beverage history. These events stained the perception of tea in the United States, and while they did lead to coffee being America's drink of choice, political necessity and geography would likely have led to our coffee adoption anyway. Still, it's interesting to think about how things could have changed if events had played out a little differently. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, let me know by clicking the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, click subscribe and the bell icon so you'll be notified when new videos are released. Do you agree that the United States was destined to become a coffee nation? Or do you think there's a scenario where tea becomes America's drink of choice? What is your favorite beverage? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again, and until next time, good night, pleasant dreams, and come again.